may have noticed that some of your products, when you buy them, are labeled as containing no GMOs. A GMO is a genetically modified organism, and simply that means that it's any organism that has had its genes manipulated. GMOs are not necessarily bad. They're simply a tool, and how they're used determines whether they're bad or good. Golden rice is a genetically modified organism that has had several genes put in it so that it contains vitamin A. And by giving this to people in developing worlds, this genetically modified organism prevents 100,000 cases of blindness each year. However, glycophosphate resistant plants are also genetically modified, and they have been associated with some harmful effects. I don't want to get too bogged down in the science, but glycophosphate resistance works because there's an enzyme called EPSPS, and it makes fatty acids in all plants. And when plants are given glycophosphate, it's like a poison, and it prevents this enzyme from working. Now, bacteria in the genus Agrobacterium has a different enzyme which is not affected by glycophosphate. So what happens is scientists take the gene from the bacteria and put it in plants. And that means that plants that now have this bacteria gene are not affected by glycophosphate. In this example, it might not be the gene manipulation that's the problem, but what it allows farmers to do. When farmers plant genetically modified organisms that have glycophosphate resistance, they spray herbicides on their crops several times a year. And what this means is that many of the produce that we buy in grocery stores test positive for glycophosphate, and it also shows up inside humans. Now, glycophosphate has been linked with cancer in certain lab animals, and many people have the idea of why should we wait until it's proven to cause problems in humans. So the problem with glycophosphate resistance is that now we can have lots of plants and produce that looks healthy, but it can be covered in herbicides, and we wouldn't know it because these plants do not show any harmful effects of having an herbicide on them. Whether you want to start growing plants to avoid eating GMOs or just as a fun hobby, I think the best place to start would be growing herbs and leafy plants like spinach and lettuce and arugula. These plants don't need any light requirements for them to flower, and plants need to flower before they produce any fruits. And you can eat them as they go, and they're often smaller plants. You can grow them in smaller containers and they take up less space in your house. Many people like to grow plants in their windows, and there's certainly nothing wrong with this. But if you have a light to supplement or simply to grow your plants under, you're going to do a lot better. Fluorescent lights are fantastic lights for growing green leafy plants. You can start off with a cheap light you get at any hardware store with the 1-inch thick bulbs. These are called a T8 bulb. A better type of fluorescent light, which you can get from HTG Supply, is called a T5, and these have small, about 5/8 in diameter lights. Here I'm using a T8 light fixture I got from a hardware store, and I like to use cool white bulbs. They have a good spectrum of light for all plants. If you're going to go and use a T8 or a 1-inch thick fluorescent light bulb, you're going to need to keep it about 1 to 2 inches above the plants, because these lights don't have a very high intensity or output of light. So keep this light about 1 to 2 inches above your plants. If you're going to use fluorescent lights like the T8 or the 1-inch thick bulbs, they're great for growing lots of small little plants like leafy plants or herbs, or for starting plants under. But if you want to have plants that produce fruit like tomatoes or peppers that get larger, look for my video on how to grow vegetables indoors. These plants are growing under the T5 with about the 1/2-inch thick skinny fluorescent tubes. These are actually a much better fluorescent light to use for growing plants because it has a more intense light output. If space is limiting, and it often is when you're growing indoors, HTG Supply also sells 2-foot long fluorescent lights. So these take up the space of about one plant tray. You can see here it's not a lot of space, and it's a great way to start getting into growing plants indoors. If you're not sure what containers to use, you don't have to worry about going too big. There's no such thing as having a container too big. But growing indoors or in your house, space can be limited. So a general rule that I tell people is that for every 1 foot of plant height, you want to have about 1 gallon of container size. And so some of the spinach and lettuce and smaller herbs can use a 1/2 to 1 gallon pots, not a very large pot. If you want to get serious about growing indoors and you want to grow a large number of plants, then you might want to try using an LED. That's what this light is here. It has a slight pink hue. Here's the basil a couple weeks later, and I'm starting some seeds over on the right. I have this LED inside of what's called a grow tent. It's kind of like a portable closet you can set up in your garage or in a room somewhere so that you can grow your plants and hang your light inside this little grow tent. I have a video out about different types of fertilizers, and a general rule for anything, kind of common sense, is follow the directions. So read the directions and follow them to the T, and you won't go wrong. I hope watching this video has encouraged you to start growing plants indoors, whether it's to avoid GMOs, to just be healthier, or to have a fun hobby so that you and maybe your family and children can learn where your food comes from. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at askthedoctor@htgsupply. Good growing.